Florence in the 15th century was a city alive with brilliance. Its narrow streets echoed with the hammering of artisans, the chants of monks, and the whispers of merchants whose fortunes rose and fell with every deal. Above it all, one family quietly shaped the destiny of the city and, by extension, of Europe itself. The Medici have long been remembered as the great patrons of the Renaissance, the family whose wealth and vision brought forth works of art, architecture, and philosophy that still inspire us today. But the truth is far richer, more complex, and far more human than the polished legend of Lorenzo the Magnificent that most of us know. The Medici story is not simply the tale of one brilliant man. It is a multi-generational saga of ambition, risk, vision, and survival. Giovanni di Bicci built the foundation with his banking empire, turning coins into influence and securing ties with the papacy. Cosimo de Medici, often called the father of the fatherland, learned how to wield that wealth with subtlety, embedding the family into the cultural and political fabric of Florence while appearing to remain a servant of the Republic. Piero the Gaudi, often dismissed in memory because of his ill health, nonetheless preserved the family's precarious position and continued its patronage of artists at a time when rivals waited for any sign of weakness. And Lorenzo, with his poetry, diplomacy, and flair, gave Florence the golden age that has forever bound his name to magnificence. Yet the story does not end with the men. Behind the brushstrokes, behind the frescoes, and behind the poetry stood the Medici women, figures like Lucrezia Tornabuoni, who infused the household with piety and learning, commissioning works of her own while nurturing the imagination of her son Lorenzo. Contessina de' Bardi, the wife of Cosimo, provided the stability and continuity that allowed the family to endure through exile and political strife. Clarice Orsini, Lorenzo's wife, brought Roman nobility and strengthened ties to the church, shaping the family's identity in ways often overlooked. Their patronage was quieter, often domestic, but it was vital to creating an environment where art and culture thrived. The Renaissance in Florence was not a miracle born of one man's genius. It was the result of many hands, many visions, and many sacrifices woven together across decades. When we peel back the layers of myth and look beyond the grand gallery of familiar names, we discover a tapestry far more intricate than the simplified story we are usually told. The Medici legacy is not a single shining thread, but a rich weave of voices, each essential in creating the pattern we still admire today. And it raises a powerful question. How many other histories have been told only in fragments, waiting for us to bring the forgotten figures back into the light? Welcome to Words of Time. In this video, we will take you beyond the legend of Lorenzo the Magnificent to explore the hidden contributions of Giovanni, Cosimo, Piero, and the Medici women who helped shape Florence's Renaissance. Stay with us as we uncover the untold stories and reveal how the true magnificence of the Medici was never the work of one person, but a collective legacy that transformed history. The image of Lorenzo the Magnificent has become one of the most enduring figures of Renaissance history, a man whose life and legend are wrapped together so tightly that separating the truth from the myth feels almost impossible. For centuries, his name has been invoked as the embodiment of Medici power, wealth, and cultural vision. He is presented as the guardian of Florence, the statesman who outmaneuvered rivals, and above all, the patron whose encouragement gave us some of the greatest art and philosophy of the Renaissance. The polished image of Lorenzo shines brightly in almost every account, reminding us of the brilliant poetry he wrote, the conversations he hosted with philosophers, and the dazzling spectacles he sponsored that filled Florence with splendor. When we think of the Medici in their golden moment, his name is the first that comes to mind. And yet, for all his undeniable impact, this grand portrait leaves much in the shadows. The story of Medici patronage, influence, and legacy cannot be held within the frame of one man, no matter how gifted he may have been. It is easy to forget that Florence was not made great by one mind alone, but by a network of individuals, many of whom remain nameless or obscured in the official accounts. The narrative shaped over time has lifted Lorenzo onto a pedestal, but in doing so, it has cast others into obscurity. The result is a legacy that feels incomplete, as if the weaving of Medici power has been reduced to a single golden thread while the rest of the tapestry lies hidden. But what if the reality of the Medici legacy was not simply a matter of Lorenzo's brilliance, but rather a much richer composition of voices, choices, and hands at work? What if the magnificence attributed to one figure was in truth the culmination of many lives intertwined? It is worth asking these questions not to diminish Lorenzo, but to widen the frame. Doing so allows us to see the Medici not as the story of one man, but as a movement shaped by family members, allies, clients, artisans, and even adversaries who together created the conditions that gave Florence its cultural and political character. This exploration invites us to move beyond the well-lit corridors of history and step into the quieter rooms where lesser-known figures left their mark. Lorenzo's presence is undeniable, but it does not eclipse the broader reality that the Medici legacy was not the work of a solitary genius. The family's rise and endurance depended on bankers, diplomats, artists, soldiers, clerics, and common citizens whose contributions, though less celebrated, were no less essential. We can imagine Florence not as a stage with one central actor commanding attention, but as a city alive with a chorus of voices, each shaping its destiny in subtle ways. Consider, for example, the figures who preceded Lorenzo and prepared the ground on which he built his power. His grandfather Cosimo, often called Pater Patriae, had already transformed Florence through his calculated diplomacy, his careful banking practices, and his quiet but persistent support of architecture and scholarship. By the time Lorenzo was born, the Medici had already woven themselves into the fabric of Florentine politics and culture. The path was not easy or guaranteed, but it was already marked out. Without Cosimo's patience and strategic vision, Lorenzo's triumphs would have had no foundation. The magnificence we attach to him rests on this earlier groundwork, a fact often acknowledged, but rarely emphasized with equal weight. Then there is the role of his father, Piero the Gouty, who held the family's fortunes together during a precarious time, facing illnesses and political challenges. Though remembered less fondly and often dismissed as weak compared to his father and son, Piero's ability to maintain balance in an unstable Florence was a key reason Lorenzo could inherit a position of influence. Even here we see how selective memory privileges one image while reducing others to footnotes. The same is true of the women of the Medici family. Their influence is harder to trace in the records because their work was less public, but their role in building alliances through marriage, maintaining networks of kinship, and managing estates was crucial. Lorenzo's mother, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, was herself a poet and a patron of religious works. Her influence on her son's upbringing, as well as her role in shaping the cultural tone of the household, deserves attention alongside his achievements. The magnificence we celebrate was nurtured in a household where her presence mattered as much as his education in politics and letters. When we turn from family to the city itself, the picture becomes even more complex. The Medici could not dominate Florence without the consent, or at least the tolerance, of many citizens who allowed their rule to grow in informal but effective ways. Lorenzo was admired, yes, but he was also resisted, mocked, and challenged. The very survival of his power depended on navigating these undercurrents with care. Behind the image of the all-powerful statesman was a constant negotiation, one that involved alliances with guilds, friendships with rival families, and delicate balancing acts with the broader public. Every festival he sponsored and every building project he supported was not simply an act of generosity, but also a political gesture designed to maintain loyalty and avert dissent. The untold stories lie in these details. Behind the gleam of marble and the brilliance of frescoes were craftsmen, architects, and engineers whose names are barely remembered today. Their hands gave material form to the visions financed by Medici wealth. They were not merely tools of Lorenzo's will but independent agents with their own skills, ideas, and ambitions. Without their artistry, magnificence would have remained an idea rather than a reality. When we stand before the works that define the Florentine Renaissance, we should remember that their existence is owed to more than the famous patron whose name dominates the accounts. The intellectual and artistic circles of the time also reflect this broader tapestry. Lorenzo encouraged scholars and poets, but the exchange of ideas was never one-directional. Thinkers like Marsilio Ficino, who revived the philosophy of Plato and gave it a Christian framework, contributed enormously to the cultural climate. Ficino was not simply a beneficiary of Medici support. He was a creator of meaning, shaping how people understood the relationship between classical learning and Christian faith. Similarly, the poets and humanists of Florence engaged in debates and experiments that extended far beyond the patron's guidance. To reduce their work to a reflection of Lorenzo's influence is to miss their own originality and power. The deeper one looks, the more it becomes clear that the magnificence of the Medici is not the property of one man, but a shared creation. This realization does not weaken Lorenzo's image, but enriches it, for it places him within a living network rather than above it. His genius was perhaps not that he alone created Florence's Renaissance, but that he recognized talent, drew people together, and gave them space to thrive. Yet even this recognition must be balanced with the fact that many of these figures acted out of their own motives, ambitions, and visions that sometimes aligned with, but at other times resisted, Medici direction. The story we inherit, polished over centuries, makes it tempting to see Lorenzo as the towering figure casting his brilliance on all around him. But history is rarely so simple. It is layered, filled with contradictions, shaped as much by the overlooked as by the celebrated. The shadow of magnificence, then, is the reminder that behind the glow of Lorenzo's reputation lie countless untold stories. They are not merely background details, but essential parts of the larger narrative. To follow these hidden threads is to embark on a journey that redefines what we mean by Medici legacy. It means acknowledging the many whose contributions have been muted or forgotten. It means reading the celebrated works not as the product of one vision, but as the outcome of collaboration, struggle, and negotiation. It means recognizing that power in Florence was never absolute, but always contingent, resting on relationships that reached far beyond the walls of the Medici palaces. The stage is set for such a journey. To step into it is to trade the comfort of a familiar tale for the excitement of discovery. We do not lose Lorenzo in this wider view. We gain a deeper understanding of the world in which he lived. By seeking the fuller tapestry, we move closer to the truth of how Florence became a beacon of the Renaissance. The magnificence we admire was real, but its shadow is just as revealing. It invites us to look again, to listen for the voices that history has quieted, and to understand the Medici not as a single shining figure, but as a legacy far richer than we have been taught. Cosimo de Medici stands in history as one of those figures who seemed to understand power in a way that was both subtle and profound. His life reveals the difference between authority that is imposed and authority that is cultivated. Unlike the image of later rulers who stood in the full glare of public admiration or criticism, Cosimo's genius lay in his ability to remain in the background, guiding the forces around him without the appearance of domination. His hand was almost invisible, yet the results of his choices were lasting. While later generations would see Lorenzo the Magnificent as the face of Medici grandeur, it was Cosimo who laid the foundations, not by force or sheer display, but through a carefully orchestrated weaving of influence, wealth, and culture. His masterstroke was to use art, architecture, and intellectual life as instruments not only of beauty but of power, embedding the Medici legacy in the very fabric of Florence. Cosimo's approach to patronage was unlike the flamboyant gestures that came later. He understood that Florence was a city wary of tyrants and allergic to open domination. Its republican structures, even when fragile or manipulated, had to be respected in form, if not always in substance. In such a setting, a family seeking power could not afford to be too visible in its ambition. Cosimo excelled at walking this fine line. His wealth from banking gave him immense resources, but he was careful in how he displayed them. Instead of building palaces that shouted arrogance, he invested in projects that seemed to benefit the public, shaping perception in ways that gained him allies rather than enemies. To be remembered as Pater Patri, the father of the fatherland, was not an accident of history. It was the result of a deliberate and far-sighted strategy. One of the most striking examples of this strategy was his investment in the convent of San Marco. Cosimo funded the rebuilding of the convent, providing resources that transformed it into a center not only of religious devotion, but also of intellectual and artistic activity. By doing so, he linked his name with piety and generosity rather than with greed or dominance. The frescoes by Fra Angelico that adorned the walls of San Marco carried messages of devotion, humility, and divine beauty. Yet behind this sacred atmosphere was Cosimo's careful design. The monks, scholars, and artists who gathered there formed part of a cultural network that reinforced Medici influence. San Marco became both a spiritual sanctuary and a beacon of learning, embodying a fusion of religion and humanist thought that was essential to Florence's identity. Cosimo's patronage here was never merely decorative. It was strategic, creating a foundation of trust and respect that protected his political position. Another project that reveals the subtlety of his vision is the Medici Library, later known as the Laurentian Library when enriched by his descendants. Cosimo collected manuscripts with a passion that went beyond mere curiosity. At a time when the recovery of classical texts was fueling the intellectual revolution we call the Renaissance, Cosimo's library became one of the great repositories of knowledge. He invested not only in gathering works, but also in making them accessible to scholars, thereby positioning the Medici name as the guardian of wisdom and learning. In an age when knowledge itself was power, Cosimo's library was a tool of influence. It was not a fortress or a weapon, yet it secured loyalty and admiration in ways no army could achieve. By enabling the revival of classical thought and its integration into Christian philosophy, Cosimo shaped the intellectual life of Florence in ways that extended far beyond his lifetime. The architectural projects he supported also carried this dual meaning of beauty and authority. The Medici Palace, designed by Michelozzo, was a masterstroke in understated grandeur. It avoided the excesses that might provoke envy or hostility, presenting instead a balanced structure that conveyed both dignity and restraint. Cosimo insisted on a design that blended into the urban fabric rather than dominating it, a gesture that spoke volumes to Florentine sensibilities. Yet within its walls, the palace became a hub of political, artistic, and social life, a place where decisions were made and relationships were cultivated. The building itself was a symbol of Cosimo's philosophy. Power should be real but not ostentatious, visible enough to command respect, but never so overwhelming as to trigger resentment. Cosimo's role as patron extended beyond bricks and mortar. His support for thinkers such as Marsilio Ficino created an intellectual climate that would shape European thought for generations. Ficino's translations of Plato and his development of a Christian Platonism were made possible by Medici support. This was not a casual gesture, but part of Cosimo's larger vision of aligning the Medici name with wisdom and cultural leadership. In encouraging scholarship, he ensured that the family was seen not simply as wealthy bankers, but as leaders in the deeper realm of human understanding. The image of the Medici as protectors of learning was as carefully constructed as the stones of San Marco or the Medici Palace, and it endured long after Cosimo's death. The long-term impact of this behind-the-scenes patronage is hard to overstate. By rooting Medici influence in the cultural and intellectual life of Florence, Cosimo built a foundation that could withstand political shifts and rivalries. Wealth alone could be lost or seized. Power based on brute force could be overturned. But influence embedded in art, architecture, and scholarship had a different quality. It became part of the city itself, woven into its churches, its libraries, and its identity. Every time a citizen entered San Marco, every time a scholar consulted a manuscript in the Medici library, every time a Florentine admired the balance of the Medici Palace, Cosimo's presence was there, subtle but enduring. This strategy also meant that his descendants inherited not just riches, but a carefully cultivated image. Lorenzo's magnificence, so often celebrated, would not have been possible without the groundwork laid by Cosimo. The younger Medici could be more flamboyant precisely because the older generation had built a base of trust and legitimacy. Cosimo's genius was to recognize that true influence is not achieved in a single lifetime, but through the creation of institutions, networks, and perceptions that outlast the individual. He did not need statues or monuments in his own image. His monuments were living, breathing centers of faith, knowledge, and community, which carried the Medici name forward. When we think of Cosimo's masterstroke, it is this delicate balance that stands out. He was a man who wielded immense power while appearing to be a servant of the common good. His investments were not random acts of generosity, but calculated choices that shaped how people saw both him and his family. Florence was a fiercely independent city, deeply proud of its republican traditions, and Cosimo respected that pride even as he found ways to steer it. He never crowned himself a prince, never wore the trappings of monarchy, but in practice, he guided Florence as effectively as any ruler. The art, architecture, and scholarship he supported were the instruments of this rule, instruments far more enduring than soldiers or decrees. The legacy of Cosimo de Medici is therefore more than the story of a wealthy banker or a cunning politician. It is the story of how influence can be constructed with patience, vision, and subtlety. By embedding his family's power in the cultural fabric of Florence, he created a foundation that endured through turmoil, conspiracies, and even temporary exile. His investments in San Marco, the Medici Palace, and the library were not isolated projects, but parts of a coherent strategy, a master plan that made the Medici name synonymous with the Renaissance itself. In this sense, Cosimo was not only the architect of buildings and patron of artists, but the architect of influence, designing a legacy that shaped Florence and, through it, the wider world. The narrative of Medici greatness is too often told in broad strokes, highlighting the brilliance of figures like Lorenzo the Magnificent or the far-seeing strategies of Cosimo de Medici, while leaving in the shadows those family members whose work was less glamorous but no less important. If we look closely at the arc of the Medici story, it becomes clear that the magnificence we associate with Florence in the 15th century would not have been possible without the steady, if quieter, hands of Piero the Gaudi and Giovanni di Bicci. Their lives and choices form an essential bridge in the Medici legacy, ensuring both continuity and expansion. Though their names do not glitter as brightly in the annals of cultural history, they were unsung patrons, providing the resources, stability, and direction that made the flowering of art, architecture, and learning possible. To understand the Renaissance in Florence, we must give them their due place alongside the more celebrated members of their family. Giovanni di Bicci, the patriarch whose career established the foundation of Medici power, was in many ways the quiet architect of the family's rise. He was not a man of ostentation. Unlike his descendants who became identified with dazzling displays of wealth, Giovanni cultivated an image of moderation and prudence. His genius lay in banking, where he displayed a rare ability to combine practical skill with political awareness. Through his leadership, the Medici Bank grew into one of the most powerful financial institutions in Europe, with branches that reached from Rome to London. This network did more than amass wealth. It created influence. Banking in that period was inseparable from politics, and Giovanni understood how to maneuver in both realms. One of his most important moves was securing the papal accounts. By becoming the banker of the Pope, Giovanni not only ensured a steady stream of revenue, but also positioned the Medici family at the heart of European finance. This relationship with the Church was not without risks, given the complex politics of Rome and the moral suspicions attached to moneylending. Yet Giovanni handled it with care, keeping his family's image largely respectable while reaping the enormous benefits of papal patronage. Every loan to a monarch, every transfer of funds for the papacy, increased the Medici's reach. These dealings were the invisible scaffolding upon which the visible magnificence of later generations would rest. Giovanni's role as a patron is often overshadowed by those who came after him, but even in his lifetime he invested in works that reflected his vision. He was a supporter of architecture, contributing to projects such as the Sacristy of San Lorenzo, the church that would become the spiritual home of the Medici family. His choice to link the family name with this religious institution was deliberate. It grounded their identity not only in banking wealth, but also in piety and civic responsibility. The investments he made were not showpieces intended to dazzle. They were steady, thoughtful contributions that laid down roots. The sacristy became both a burial place and a symbol of continuity, binding the Medici name to Florence's sacred landscape. From Giovanni's careful building of the financial and cultural base, the torch passed to his son Cosimo, who, as we have seen, transformed the family into the true power of Florence. Yet between Cosimo and Lorenzo lies another crucial figure, Piero the Gaudi. His very nickname suggests frailty and limitation, a man remembered more for his physical suffering than for his achievements. History has not been kind to Piero, often treating him as a weak link between stronger generations. But a closer look reveals a more balanced picture. While he lacked the dynamism of his father and the charisma of his son, Piero nonetheless played a critical role in preserving and extending Medici influence during a difficult moment. Piero inherited not only the wealth of the Medici Bank, but also the envy and hostility that such dominance provoked. Florence was a city of rival families, and resentment against the Medici was never far from the surface. The Albizzi, the Puzzi, and others waited for any opportunity to challenge Medici authority. Piero's task was therefore less about expansion and more about survival. That he managed to hold the family's position in spite of his ill health and constant conspiracies is itself a mark of resilience. His gout confined him to his home for long periods, earning him the nickname that has colored his historical image. Yet from that very home, he continued to manage affairs, relying on trusted allies and careful judgment. Like his father and grandfather, Piero understood the importance of patronage. He supported artists and architects, ensuring that the Medici remained visible as benefactors of Florence. His commissions were not as bold or revolutionary as those associated with Lorenzo, but they contributed to the steady growth of Renaissance art. It was under Piero that the Medici patronage of Donatello continued, and he is also remembered for his support of Fra Filippo Lippi. These artists added to the cultural capital of the Medici, producing works that enriched the city while also reinforcing the family's image as guardians of beauty and learning. One often overlooked aspect of Piero's patronage is its continuity. Where Cosimo had laid foundations, Piero ensured they did not falter. He oversaw the completion of projects begun by his father, including works at San Marco and San Lorenzo. This continuity mattered. In a city where abrupt change could destabilize politics and erode loyalty, the Medici presented themselves as a constant presence, a family that could be relied upon to support the civic and spiritual life of Florence. Piero's careful stewardship kept that promise alive, even when his own health limited his public appearances. The Medici story is often told as though it leaps from Cosimo's brilliance to Lorenzo's magnificence, but the thread between them is Piero's endurance. Without his ability to preserve the family's position during his brief leadership, Lorenzo would not have inherited a stable base from which to flourish. In this sense, Piero's contribution was as crucial as it was quiet. He may not have dazzled his contemporaries, but he kept the family's fortunes intact. To overlook him is to miss an essential piece of the Medici puzzle. Returning to Giovanni di Bicci, it is worth stressing again how much of what we call the Renaissance depended on his banking empire. Art does not emerge in a vacuum. Frescoes, sculptures, and manuscripts require funding, and that funding often came from the intricate financial networks he built. The exchange of money across borders allowed for the exchange of ideas, texts, and materials. Giovanni's bank was not simply a place of profit. It was a channel through which the cultural currents of Europe flowed. The gold that paid for Florentine chapels might have come from London merchants, Roman tithes, or Bruges traders, all moved by Medici hands. In this sense, Giovanni was a patron of the Renaissance in a structural way, making possible the conditions under which artists and scholars could thrive. His influence also shaped the family's approach to wealth itself. Giovanni was cautious about conspicuous displays, preferring to invest in ways that seemed civic-minded rather than self-indulgent. This restraint set the tone for Cosimo's more sophisticated strategy of cultural patronage and helped shield the Medici from accusations of tyranny. The lesson was clear. If you wish to hold power in Florence, you must be seen as serving Florence. Giovanni's careful cultivation of this image became a legacy that his descendants adapted to their own times. The contributions of Piero and Giovanni, while less dazzling than those of Lorenzo or Cosimo, are therefore threads without which the fabric of the Renaissance would unravel. Giovanni's financial empire funded the revival of classical learning and the commissioning of sacred art. Piero's steady, if unglamorous, support ensured continuity through a period of potential vulnerability. Together, they represent the quieter side of patronage, the foundation upon which magnificence could later be built. Their stories remind us that the Renaissance was not only about genius and spectacle, but also about endurance, prudence, and stability. If we step back and view the Medici legacy as a tapestry, Giovanni and Piero are not the brilliant, colorful threads that draw the eye immediately. They are the strong, understated fibers that hold the whole pattern together. Without them, the design would collapse. It is tempting to focus only on the bright flourishes of Lorenzo's patronage or Cosimo's strategic brilliance, but the fabric is richer when we recognize the contributions of those who worked in quieter ways. Giovanni's banking empire, Piero's persistence in adversity, their shared commitment to art and architecture even when overshadowed, all of these shaped the Renaissance as surely as the more celebrated figures did. This perspective invites us to rethink the way we tell the story of the Renaissance. Too often it is narrated as a series of great individuals, each a genius in art, politics, or philosophy. But behind each genius stood a network of support, and behind each dazzling commission stood the financial and political scaffolding built by figures like Giovanni di Bicci and Piero the Gaudi. To acknowledge them is not to diminish the brilliance of others, but to understand the fuller truth. Florence's golden age was the result not of isolated stars, but of constellations, some shining more brightly, others quietly steady, all necessary to the light we still see. The story of the Medici family is usually told through the names of men whose political maneuvering and cultural patronage became the scaffolding of Florence's Renaissance glory. Cosimo, Lorenzo, Giovanni, and Piero dominate the pages of history, their contributions recorded in political chronicles, banking accounts, and the enduring works of art and architecture they sponsored. Yet beneath and alongside these well-known figures existed another current of influence, quieter but no less essential, carried out by the women of the family. These women rarely sat at the center of public power, nor did they commission monumental palaces or dominate Florentine assemblies. Their realm was domestic, relational, and often private. But within that sphere, they nurtured the culture of Florence, promoted artists and artisans, and created networks of influence that carried profound consequences. To neglect their story is to misread the Medici legacy, for without them the tapestry of Renaissance Florence would lack some of its richest and most subtle threads. One of the most remarkable examples is Lucrezia Tornabuoni, the wife of Piero the Gouty and mother of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Her role has often been reduced to that of mother and spouse, but in truth, she was a cultural force in her own right. Lucrezia was a poet, a patron of religious art, and a woman of letters whose influence shaped both her household and the city. Her poems, often on sacred themes, were widely circulated and admired. At a time when women's voices in literature were rarely heard, Lucrezia established herself as a writer who could contribute to Florence's spiritual and cultural life. But more than her own writing, it was her role as a patron and organizer of cultural activity that reveals her deeper significance. Lucrezia commissioned works of art for chapels and convents, encouraging the production of religious paintings and decorations that enriched Florence's sacred spaces. These commissions were not grand public gestures like the construction of palaces or libraries, but they carried an intimate significance. They shaped the spiritual environment of communities, inspired devotion, and provided opportunities for artists to refine their craft. In this way, Lucrezia's patronage not only added to the city's artistic wealth, but also provided the soil from which larger achievements could grow. Beyond her own patronage, Lucrezia also wielded influence through her extensive social networks. As a member of the powerful Tornabuoni family, she had connections that extended into other Florentine lineages and beyond. Marriage in Renaissance Florence was as much about politics as it was about family, and Lucrezia's position enabled her to act as a mediator, negotiator, and connector. Artists and writers often benefited from these networks, finding patrons and audiences through her introductions. What we see here is a different mode of patronage than that practiced by her husband or son. Where men of the Medici family used wealth to commission works that enhanced civic prestige, Lucrezia used relationships and household resources to foster creativity within the fabric of everyday life. Her influence on her children was also profound. Lorenzo grew up in a household where poetry, religious devotion, and artistic patronage were not abstract ideals but lived realities. Lucrezia's encouragement of learning and artistic appreciation shaped his imagination long before he emerged as the patron of Florence's golden age. When we admire Lorenzo's magnificence, we must remember that much of it was nurtured in the environment Lucrezia created. In her own way, she was as much an architect of Medici cultural power as Cosimo or Giovanni. But Lucrezia was not alone. Across generations, Medici women carried forward this tradition of quiet but essential cultural support. Consider Contessina de' Bardi, the wife of Cosimo de Medici. Her role in the family has often been overshadowed by her husband's immense achievements, but her influence was substantial. The Bardi family was itself a prominent Florentine house, and her marriage to Cosimo linked the Medici to a lineage with deep financial and political connections. In her domestic role, Contessina helped manage the household during Cosimo's frequent absences and ensured the continuity of family and social ties. She supported charitable works and religious institutions, extending the Medici reputation for piety and generosity into realms where Cosimo's direct involvement might have been less visible. Contessina's influence was particularly evident in the ways she guided the upbringing of her children and grandchildren. Her steady presence provided a sense of stability during times of political upheaval, including Cosimo's temporary exile. By keeping the household intact and maintaining alliances, she ensured that the family could recover its position. Again, this is a form of patronage not always recognized. The patronage of stability, of continuity, of relationships. Without it, the grander gestures of Cosimo might have faltered. Another figure worth attention is Clarice Orsini, the wife of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Her marriage brought a connection between the Medici and one of the great Roman noble families, strengthening the family's ties to the broader Italian political landscape. Clarice's role in Florence was not always easy. She was sometimes criticized for her Roman background and her religious conservatism, which clashed with the more humanist tone of Lorenzo's circle. Yet she exerted influence in her own way, particularly in matters of family and religion. She commissioned works for convents and chapels, reinforcing the Medici association with piety and service to the church. She also played a part in managing the household during Lorenzo's absences and contributed to the education of their children. Among those children was Giovanni, who would later become Pope Leo X, a reminder of how the values instilled within the household could echo across history. The pattern that emerges is one of women who, though excluded from formal political power, exercised cultural influence through patronage, networks, and family stewardship. They did not command armies or dominate assemblies, but they shaped the social and artistic environment of Florence in ways that were both intimate and enduring. Their commissions may have been smaller in scale, but they were no less important in fostering the artistic vibrancy that made Florence unique. It is also important to consider the symbolic role of these women in the Medici image. Florence was a city where public reputation mattered deeply, and the behavior of women in elite families reflected on the honor of the entire household. By engaging in acts of charity, commissioning religious works, and embodying ideals of piety and learning, Medici women reinforced the family's image as benefactors of the city. Their influence was not merely private. It radiated outward, shaping how the Medici were perceived by their peers and rivals. The story of these women also challenges our understanding of what it means to be a patron. When we think of patronage, we often imagine monumental works, grand fresco cycles, or architectural marvels. But patronage can also mean providing a convent with an altarpiece, supporting a young artist with a modest commission, or financing the production of religious poetry. These acts, though less dramatic, were integral to the cultural ecosystem. They sustained a wide range of artists and artisans, many of whom might not otherwise have found support. They ensured that art was not confined to palaces and public squares, but permeated daily life. If we step back and place the contributions of Lucrezia Tornabuoni, Contessina de' Bardi, and Clarice Orsini alongside those of Giovanni, Cosimo, Piero, and Lorenzo, we see a fuller picture of the Medici legacy. The grandeur of Florence was not the work of men alone, but the result of a collaborative effort in which women played a vital part. They were not merely companions or background figures. They were active participants in the shaping of culture, using the tools available to them, household resources, social networks, religious devotion, to foster an environment where art and learning could flourish. Their story also speaks to the broader dynamics of Renaissance society. Women of elite families were often constrained by expectations of marriage, piety, and domestic responsibility. Yet within those constraints, they found ways to exert influence. The Medici women exemplify how such influence could be directed toward cultural patronage. By embracing roles as mothers, wives, and benefactors, they turned domestic spaces into cultural spaces, shaping the values and tastes of future generations. The vibrancy of Florence during the Renaissance was not simply the product of great artists and powerful patrons. It was the result of countless interactions, small and large, between men and women, between families and communities, between public and private spheres. The Medici matriarchs remind us that culture is not built only in halls of power or on canvases of genius, but also in homes, convents, and chapels, in the steady encouragement of creativity and devotion. When we think of the Renaissance as a rebirth, we should remember that birth is not a solitary act, but a collaborative one, involving nurture, support, and care. The women behind the Medici brushstrokes embodied this truth. Their hands may not have painted frescoes or carved marble, but they created the conditions in which such works could be imagined and realized. Their influence, though often hidden, is woven into the fabric of Florence as surely as the more visible legacies of their husbands and sons. To bring their story into the light is to see the Medici legacy in its full richness. It is to acknowledge that magnificence was not only public spectacle, but also private devotion, not only monumental architecture, but also intimate chapels, not only male ambition, but also female stewardship. The Renaissance, as it unfolded in Florence, was a symphony in which every voice mattered, and the voices of the Medici women, though often muted, gave the music much of its depth and harmony. When we reach the point of looking at the Renaissance in Florence not only as the brilliance of a single figure, but as the confluence of an entire family's efforts, the story acquires a depth that is often missing from conventional narratives. The popular image tends to frame Lorenzo the Magnificent as the radiant star around which all else orbited, as if the cultural rebirth of a city could be the work of one man's vision alone. Yet the closer we draw to the details of the Medici legacy, the clearer it becomes that magnificence was never solitary. It was built layer upon layer, shaped by multiple voices, supported by countless choices, and carried forward by individuals whose contributions ranged from monumental projects to quiet acts of stewardship. The Medici story, in its fullest telling, is not about isolated brilliance but about continuity, cooperation, and collective imagination. Giovanni di Bicci laid the first stone by crafting a banking empire that transformed gold into power and access. His prudence, restraint, and strategic alignment with the papacy created the economic backbone without which no cultural patronage would have been possible. He understood that wealth had to be converted into legitimacy, and legitimacy required visible service to the community. Thus, his early commissions in San Lorenzo were as much investments in faith and reputation as they were in stone and mortar. From his careful hands, the Medici became not merely wealthy merchants but a family of civic stature. Cosimo, his son, transformed this base into a durable network of influence. His genius lay in working from the shadows, guiding Florence without ever appearing to dominate it outright. Through his investment in San Marco, his library, and the palace that bore his name, he embedded the Medici presence into the city's fabric. He chose patronage that blended with civic pride, aligning his family with the values of learning, faith, and balance. His was the architecture of influence, a legacy of buildings, texts, and ideas that would shelter the Medici reputation long after his death. Piero the Gouty, though weakened by illness, played the role of custodian. In an era when enemies circled, waiting for signs of weakness, he preserved what Cosimo had built. He maintained artists under Medici protection, continued projects, and ensured that continuity prevailed over collapse. It was he who bridged the family's fortunes between the strategist father and the magnificent son, a bridge often overlooked but essential. Without his diligence, the family might have faltered before Lorenzo could rise. Lorenzo, of course, shines brightly in memory. His poetry, his charisma, his circle of philosophers and artists gave Florence a golden sheen. He embodied the ideal of the Renaissance man, blending politics, culture, and art into a living spectacle of civic grandeur. But even Lorenzo's magnificence rested on the scaffolding built by his ancestors and kin. His success was not the birth of a new tradition, but the flowering of seeds sown by Giovanni, nurtured by Cosimo, and protected by Piero. And beyond the men, the Medici women played indispensable roles. Lucrezia Tornabuoni, Lorenzo's mother, infused the household with poetry, piety, and the habit of artistic patronage. Her religious commissions and her poetry provided a softer, more intimate form of cultural support, shaping her son's imagination and reinforcing the family's connection to spiritual life. Contessina de Bardi, Cosimo's wife, managed the household during times of exile and unrest, sustaining networks of loyalty and preserving the family's stability. Clarice Orsini, Lorenzo's wife, linked the family to Roman nobility and reinforced their connection to religious institutions. Their work often went unrecorded, yet their presence in the background shaped the texture of Medici identity as much as any public commission. Seen together, these figures reveal that the Medici legacy was not the triumph of one man's brilliance, nor even of one generation's foresight, but of an entire lineage weaving together political prudence, financial strategy, cultural patronage, and domestic stability. Each figure contributed in ways that were distinct yet complementary. Giovanni provided the foundation, Cosimo built the architecture of influence, Piero preserved continuity, Lorenzo brought spectacle and brilliance, and the women fostered the environment that sustained creativity and learning. The Medici tapestry is richer when we see all these threads interwoven, rather than isolating the brightest strand and ignoring the rest. This more holistic view of the Renaissance reminds us that cultural rebirth is rarely the work of individuals alone. The Florence we celebrate as a beacon of beauty and intellect was not the creation of Lorenzo's magnificence in isolation. It was the sum of decades of careful stewardship, risk-taking, quiet persistence, and collaborative vision. Every fresco in San Marco, every manuscript in the Medici library, every chapel in San Lorenzo, every poem recited in the Medici household, carried within it the unseen labor of men and women whose names have not always been granted the glow of memory. To consider the Renaissance in this way is to challenge the way we tell history itself. Our narratives often crave simplicity, preferring to celebrate singular geniuses, great men whose actions seem to alter the course of nations single-handedly. But reality is more intricate. Genius is rarely solitary. Patronage is rarely the act of one person's whim. Behind every masterpiece are countless decisions, networks, and influences, many of them invisible in the finished product. Michelangelo may have carved marble into living flesh, but without Medici patronage, without the networks of artisans, quarrymen, and financiers, the block of marble might never have been placed before him. Ficino may have revived Plato, but without the support of Cosimo and the intellectual environment shaped by household culture, his ideas might have remained marginal. Even Lorenzo's feasts and festivals, remembered as dazzling spectacles, were possible only through the labors of those who arranged, financed, and sustained them. When we allow ourselves to look beyond the grand gallery of well-known figures, we discover a renaissance that is richer, more communal, and more deeply human. It is not a story of solitary brilliance, but of collective effort. The Medici exemplify this truth because their legacy spans generations and encompasses diverse modes of influence: banking, politics, art, religion, literature, and domestic life. The magnificence of Florence emerged from this interplay, a harmony of many voices rather than a solo performance. To conclude the Medici story with Lorenzo alone is to end on a note of magnificence without hearing the full symphony. To include Giovanni, Cosimo, Piero, Lucrezia, Contessina, Clarice, and others is to hear the deeper music of history, the harmony of continuity and collaboration. And when we hear that harmony, a question inevitably arises. How many other historical narratives are waiting to be enriched by the untold contributions of figures often relegated to the shadows?